Hey, what's up? Todd here, and today I want to talk about one of the most frequent things I get asked, which surprisingly has very little to do with game. See, a couple times in the past, I've done some videos where I've done book recommendations, and apparently those have gone over relatively well, and I keep getting asked for another video on book recommendations, other things people should read, that kind of stuff. So I'm going to do that today, but I'm going to do that with a particular kind of purpose in mind and a particular kind of nod to the current situation we're in, because I want to be as helpful and as useful to you as I can. Worldwide, but especially in the United States, my country, we've had it pretty good for a really, really long time. Since the World War, which wasn't really even on our soil, we've had things, relatively good. Maybe we had the Cold War for a little bit, but again, we came out of that okay. And, in my lifetime, there really hasn't been too much that's gone wrong, too much tumult, whatever. And so we've had, things very nice. And now when all of a sudden a lot of things are going wrong all at once, it's very hard to handle. It's very shocking for a lot of people. And so I'm going to give you some book recommendations that are not going to be political, not going to be about the current time or anything like that. I'm not even going to touch that. But some books that I think will help you through the current time because of what they can teach you about yourself, what they can teach you about your world, and how they can help you to understand tough times and get through them. So the first one I want to recommend to you is a book called NonZero. The subtitle of this one is The Logic of Human Destiny, and it's a very interesting book. The idea of non-zero is this idea of zero-sumness, which is where people are fighting and there's a winner and a loser. Non-zero, or a positive sum, is where there's cooperation and people are on net benefited by their human interaction. And that's what basically his thesis is that history is the story of maximizing human cooperation, maximizing non-zero sum outcomes, the positive shared growth and improvement. Not necessarily because everybody had the best of intentions, but because there's this kind of uniting force in history. And so NonZero is an interesting book. It's essentially a history book, but it's written by an evolutionary biologist, i.e. someone who studies evolution. And what he's done is he looked at history through the lens of evolution. So he looked at how did societies evolve and how did they compete and thrive, right? Because a society that's effective will tend to survive. A society that's very ineffective will either be overthrown or conquered or various other things. And so over time, history becomes a breeding ground or a proving ground of ideas, right? This thing called memetics, the ideas that govern us, the ideas that shape us. And different governing styles work better at different times or in different situations. And different governing styles just work better, full stop, than others in some cases. But he basically looks at human history, and he has really interesting ideas on things like why did Europe went into, after the Roman Empire, it's like the Dark Ages, but then they came out of the Dark Ages as one of the dominant forces on Earth. Why is that? What happened? And it turns out that actually the feudal governing system during the Dark Ages was incredibly efficient for testing new ideas and coming to better governing systems because of its hierarchical but versatile and flexible nature. Every history is built on conquest because any civilization that didn't have conquest got conquered. Right? That's just the nature of it. But at the same time, history has led to better and better ways of life and more sharing and more cooperation. So you have this kind of massive force where a lot of fighting and a lot of negativity actually leads to a lot of positive things. And it's actually a beautiful thing in a lot of ways. But understanding it comes together can help you understand at this point where we're at a kind of a crossroads in history, what's maybe really important, what's not important, the direction we're all going in. It can help you to understand the forces that are uniting us and bringing us together, but at the same time, the forces that are fractionating us and tearing us apart. And he even has some pretty decent ideas and potential lessons for how the world might go. He's modest enough to not say this is what the future looks like, but he does present some ideas of how things could go based on these themes that I think are very interesting. And they're ideas that I kind of thought they were a little far-fetched when I first read the book, but having seen what's happened in the most recent times, I do think they're a lot more important than I did at the time. And I went back and reread those chapters, and I found them very, very fascinating. So I want to recommend that book to you. I think it's one of the best history books I've ever read, in that it really does give you a cause and effect idea and of the kind of the direction of history without saying that any specific thing will happen, right? So it was pretty much guaranteed that we would have cooperation in advance of technology and these things that we've had. However, that could have come from any of 100 different countries, and different empires could have fallen or not fallen, and that's all kind of arbitrary, but the general direction of global history is pretty deterministic. So anyway, it's a really great book. Definitely opened my eyes. I think it can open your eyes as well. Also, he's a great author in general, Robert Wright. He also wrote some of my favorite books in terms of the realm of evolutionary biology, which is a topic I love as well. So anyway, first book I'm going to recommend to you, NonZero, The Logic of Human Destiny. Second book I'm going to get into is related to one I've recommended before. The last time that I did a book recommendations, I actually recommended a book called The Fountainhead, which is a really, really long book by someone named Ayn Rand. And I recommended that one because I think it is one of the best examples of self-esteem and integrity in terms of the characters that I've ever seen, and in terms of explaining what self-esteem is under pressure, explaining what integrity is under pressure. I've always in the past said that The Fountainhead was my favorite book of hers, and Atlas Shrugged not as much. And the reason I gave for that was that I honestly thought The Fountainhead was a lot more realistic, and Atlas Shrugged was a little far-fetched. It seemed a little science fiction-y, and it seemed like, she was, getting a little ideological with things, and it seemed like she was maybe, extrapolating from these really tiny events a lot of big things. But then again, in the past, half a year or so, I've seen a lot of, funny enough, the things that when I read them in Atlas Shrugged, I'm like, nah, that's nonsense. That would never happen. Oh, that's unimportant. Let's just skim past that part and get to the important stuff. I've seen a lot of those unimportant things that she gave a lot of focus to actually kind of manifest in the world. And I've seen how they're important. For example, the story essentially is about these huge global moving events, but she spends a lot of time talking about little local committees that were formed and just sat around talking and didn't seem to really do anything, but then just kind of changed the way people thought in subtle ways. Right? And I never thought that was really that important, but seeing how ideologies are, do grow, and how essentially Ayn Rand came from a background of having experience with communist Russia, so she knew how propaganda works, and seeing the grassroots levels where where and how ideas really spread, and where these silly things that people almost kind of let them slide because they don't seem important become extremely important if they go unchecked. So anyway, it's a really, I think, brilliant book, worth a read, but it is very, very long. And it's kind of about a society that's on the verge of breakdown. So if you don't have enough time to read that one, I would encourage you instead to read a much shorter book about a society that already has broken down into what was intended to be a utopia but ended up being a hell, which would be the book 1984 by George Orwell. That one's a pretty famous book, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but it is also an incredible book, and it will definitely make you think. A couple of the key concepts in that are the ideas of doublethink, which is sharing the contradictory ideas in your head at the same time, which you can't possibly believe, but you're forced to believe because of the system. And this idea called newspeak, which they keep coining new words that you're forced to keep learning, and those words are new thoughts that you're forced to agree with. So those are two ideas in a totalitarian regime that are very, very interesting, that I'm seeing minor shades of nowadays. So I wanted to point that out as well. Okay, so those are two books, a little bit along. They have to do with not ideology per se, but somehow how ideologies are spread and how ideas are communicated. And I think that's a very important idea of our time, is how you digest the ideas that are being put out to you, how you believe what you choose to believe, and what you treat as important and what you don't treat as important, because I think that is very, very important, and it's a critical issue of our time. Okay, and with that in mind, that brings me to my third recommendation, which is, it's a book on statistics. And before you tune out and say I hate math, it's exactly the point. I'm going to give you a statistics book that's actually fun to read, but I think it is very, very important to know statistics. I think it's incredibly important to know about statistics, and it's one of the biggest failings, I think, of the American educational system, is the fact that people don't truly understand statistics very well. And what that means is it's very, very easy for people to be lied to. And so the book that I actually would love to recommend, but I can't, is a book I read as a child called How to Lie with Statistics. And the reason I can't recommend it is I don't know how to find it. I think it may be out of print. But it basically talks about all these different ways that you can take the very same data and you can tell a completely different story with the same data, right? You can tell one story that says you should do this thing and another story that says you shouldn't do this thing with the exact same data, just based on how you skew the statistics, how you draw the graphs, the in points you choose, the out points you choose, what sample you choose to work from or don't choose to work from, etc. And so people have a lot of belief when they hear numbers and statistics that they're somehow accurate or true. Statistics can easily be manipulated by people with agendas, so it's very important that you understand statistics so you can see through that and so you aren't manipulated by them. So the book I'm actually going to recommend along these lines is a book called The Flaw of Averages, which, like I said, it is about math and statistics, but it's actually written to be quite readable, quite fun. It has great examples, great stories in it. I found it highly, highly engaging, even though I already knew a lot of the concepts. As the concepts are more eye-opening, it should be even more so. And I think it also treat statistics in a way that's more conceptual rather than heavily mathematical and heavily like computational, which is obviously no fun for anybody. All right, so A Flaw of Averages, or if you can find it, the older book, How to Lie with Statistics. Great books that I think everybody should read. Okay, and the fourth and final book that I'm going to recommend is more of a personal story. Not my personal story, but it is somebody's personal story, and I think it's very, very good. Because again, as I mentioned at the start, worldwide, but especially in the United States, I think we've become a little bit coddled. I think we've become a little bit soft because we haven't had a lot of hardening experiences. So the book I'm going to recommend is actually from a very famous author, the guy who wrote, you may be familiar with The Big Short or Moneyball, because they're both made into movies. He's also written a lot of other best-selling books that have been pretty amazing. A guy named Michael Lewis. Anyway, he did one very short book, though, that was based on his own personal experience. It's a book called Coach. And basically what it is, it's the story of his high school baseball coach. And this guy is a coach who has had a massive influence on a lot of kids coming through his high school. And he was a very tough coach. He was one of those kind of hard-nosed disciplinarian, like, you know, you have to like come up and meet my expectations type of coach. And tons of his alumni students have come back and said he was the single biggest influence on their educational life. He was the single biggest formative experience that made them the adults they are today and helped them to survive and thrive in the world. And so they, at this time of writing of the book, want to actually come back and have the gym named after him and give him all these accolades. But ironically, at the exact same time, the current crop of kids that he's teaching are having a lot of complaints about him, and in particular the parents are having a lot of complaints that he's like too hard on their kids, or he's overbearing, or these various things. And so he's on the verge of losing his job. So there's this weird kind of contradiction where this guy who has influenced so many lives in such a clearly positive way and been like so critical in the growth of these children, now that the parents of the children, who have to assume have their best interests at heart, are trying to get rid of that very experience for them. And it really gets to the heart of some of the experiences that maybe build some toughness, that build some character, that build some integrity, that some of our well-intentioned things that we're doing may be depriving us of. And a lot of times these best laid plans and best intentions are actually doing us a lot more harm than good. And I think it's a very interesting exploration, a very, very readable book, very engaging, and it's very short as well. I think I didn't read it, I actually listened to it on Audible. I think it was only a couple hours, maybe even an hour. Very, very short read. But incredible book that I would highly recommend, especially again to anyone in the United States, but anyone in these kind of Western democratized countries where things have been so good for so long, or anywhere where things just have been nice and you haven't really had to deal with a lot of hardship. I think it's an amazing book, very, very eye-opening. I want to part by saying one further thing, which is if you like these ideas, like when I give you book recommendations, or when I talk about things that are maybe not strictly related to game, if you're really enjoying those, I do talk a lot about those things, or I go a lot deeper in those areas on my podcast, which is the Todd V Show. It's on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, etc. I also talk a lot about game. I talk a ton about game on there too, and I go a lot deeper into things I can't necessarily put on YouTube there as well in terms of game. So I would definitely check that out if you want a deeper perspective on game, and then also on life. I recently did a bit on finance and personal wealth and that kind of stuff, which actually, funny enough, has been the most popular podcast on the whole channel. So anyway, a lot of really good content over there. If you want some of my deeper thoughts on life and also tons of my deeper thoughts on game, check that out as well. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you check out some of those books. Maybe check out the podcast. Till then, take care, be safe, talk soon.